Hello everyone and welcome to today's StudyTalks webinar, Head Injury and Alzheimer's Disease. Does playing football lead to dementia? Before we begin the presentation, I want to provide a few housekeeping items. Today's webinar is being recorded and all participants will be muted during the webinar to limit background noise. At the end of the presentation, there will be a question and answer session. You may submit text questions at any time by using the questions pane of the control panel. For any questions that we are not able to address during the Q&A session, we will do our best to respond via email. We are delighted to have Dr. Robert Stern, who is Professor of Neurology, Neurosurgery, and Anatomy and Neurobiology at Boston University School of Medicine, where he is also Director of the Clinical Core of the BU Alzheimer's Disease and CTE Center, one of only 30 Alzheimer's disease research centers funded by the National Institutes of Health. Dr. Stern is a clinician, educator, and mentor, as well as an active clinical neuroscience researcher. A major focus of his research involves the long-term effects of repetitive head impacts in athletes, including the neurodegenerative disease chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE. He is the lead co-principal investigator of a $16 million NIH grant for a multi-center longitudinal study to develop methods of diagnosing CTE during life as well as examining potential risk factors of the disease. Dr. Stern's other current major area of funded research includes the assessment and treatments of Alzheimer's disease. With that, I will turn the mic over to Dr. Stern.
Well, thank you very much. It's really an honor to have been asked to do this webinar, and I hope to be able to answer a lot of questions out there that may be kind of lingering out in society, and hopefully people will leave this webinar being able to talk to their friends, talk to their doctors, and provide them with information that they themselves may not know. And so I want to start by just going over an outline of what I'll be talking about today, starting with some definitions and some clarifications for most listeners. I'll be going over a very basic issue of the difference between dementia and Alzheimer's disease. And then I'm going to go over the difference between a traumatic brain injury, or TBI, and concussion. Follow that, I'm going to come up with hopefully some answers to the question, is TBI, or traumatic brain injury, a risk factor for developing Alzheimer's disease? I'm then going to change gears a little bit in order to answer the questions of the relationship between TBI and Alzheimer's disease by going over the differences between concussion, something else called subconcussive trauma, and a term that we use now in our research called repetitive head impacts. And then I'm going to talk about this disease, the one that's really hard to pronounce, the one that people hear a lot about on TV and the news and you name it, called chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE. And CTE, I'll be going over different things about the exposure to repetitive head impacts through contact sports and other activities, and describing that that type of exposure can lead to a unique neurodegenerative disease that is similar to Alzheimer's, but a unique disease on its own. So let's start with a question. When you look at this cartoon, the question is this normal aging, or is there something wrong with Superman? As you can see, it's Superman in his later years, wrinkles and all, about to jump out of the window to fly to save someone. And he says, dang, now where was I going? Well, that's Superman's job. He's supposed to go out and be able to save people's lives and to be able to fly right to them. And here he is forgetting where he's supposed to be going. So that's the question. Is this normal aging, or is there something wrong with Superman? And the answer is, it is not normal aging. In fact, when there is significant decline in memory and other cognitive skills, it is not part of what we would expect in normal aging. And when we have that decline in memory and other cognitive functions, and if it gets in the way of routine daily functioning, we refer to that as dementia. And so what is dementia? It's a very commonly asked question that frequently is a little cloudy out there. People aren't really sure. So let's get this straight. Dementia refers to a new loss of memory and other cognitive functioning that results in significant impairment in social or occupational functioning. In other words, that memory and other cognitive difficulty gets in the way of routine independent living. Dementia is not an illness. Dementia is not a disease. It's kind of like what happens if you have a fever. What does having a fever tell you? It merely says that you're sick. It doesn't say what's causing you to have that high temperature. And so there's many different causes of dementia. Some of them are reversible, meaning if you treat the underlying problem, the dementia will likely go away. Things like medical conditions such as hypothyroidism, things like vitamin deficiencies, especially vitamin B12 deficiency, even some psychiatric disorders like clinical depression, which is another brain disorder that if untreated or undertreated, it can lead to the cognitive and memory difficulties that could get in the way of daily life, but hopefully will then go away. Those problems will go away if treated appropriately. But what we're really talking about during this webinar are the neurodegenerative diseases, these progressive brain diseases, things like vascular dementia or frontotemporal lobar degeneration, dementia with Lewy bodies, Parkinson's disease dementia, or these last two, which I'm going to be focusing on, Alzheimer's disease, which accounts for probably 75% or even more of all cases of people with dementia, or chronic traumatic encephalopathy, another progressive brain disease that we see predominantly in athletes, contact sport athletes. And so an important thing to take home from this initial part of the webinar is that dementia is a clinical syndrome. It's a bunch of symptoms together. It is not a disease. Whereas Alzheimer's disease is one of several brain diseases that eventually leads to dementia. Some science background to just give you all a little bit of the background that many of you probably already have, that is that Alzheimer's disease as a neurodegenerative disease is marked by plaques and tangles. We've known this for well over 100 years now when Dr. Alzheimer first described the disease. And he described the hallmark features when looking at a brain of his first patient as having these things that he referred to as plaques and tangles. Now we know that the plaques are made up of an abnormal form of a protein called beta amyloid. And those tangles, they're made up of an abnormal form of another protein called tau. And these plaques and tangles, slowly but surely, lead to the progressive destruction of brain cells. And as those brain cells and the brain tissue atrophies, that's what leads to the symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. And here you see on the left-hand side half of a slice of a brain of a healthy older person, where you can see it's all plump. There's no atrophy. There's no destruction of the brain tissue that you see on the right in someone with severe Alzheimer's disease, where parts of the brain have been devastated by this disease. And this devastation and the symptoms that go with it doesn't just come out of the blue. It's not like one day you wake up and all of a sudden you've got this severe dementia from Alzheimer's disease. In fact, it's likely that the plaques and tangles begin to accumulate many, many years before there's any evidence of cognitive impairment. Research has now shown that the amyloid begins to accumulate around 25 years before any symptoms at all. And it seems that that abnormal tau protein accumulates later, after the abnormal amyloid protein starts to do its stuff. And it's the tau accumulation that is associated with the clinical symptoms of Alzheimer's disease and can be viewed as a marker of neurodegeneration, or the destruction of the brain cells. In this little diagram, what you see on the right side, the bigger brains with the blue, that's the progression of brain damage, starting here in the very early stages of the disease. But once there are some symptoms, you've got this destruction in part of the brain that is responsible for memory, learning new things and recalling it. And as the disease progresses, more tissue is destroyed, more brain tissue is hurt. And then later in the disease, you can see almost the entire brain gets destroyed. Over here, though, what we're looking at is the progression of the phosphorylated tau, the abnormal tau protein in Alzheimer's disease. Here's where there's not that much problem from the tau, and that doesn't seem to lead to any clinical symptoms. But here is the beginnings of the abnormal tau, and that's probably what's leading to the destruction here on the right of that part of the brain. Here, the tau seems to get more pronounced and wider distributed, and it can then lead to this next stage. And here, the tau devastation is all over the brain, leading to the destruction of the brain tissue. And from that, we now have a view of Alzheimer's disease, starting with what we refer to as preclinical, meaning there's no symptoms. The brain changes, especially from that amyloid, have begun, but there's no symptoms. And so the person wouldn't complain. There's no evidence that there is a problem, except that if you looked at the brain, you could see that the amyloid starts to accumulate. And then at some point, there may be some complaints. There may be some awareness that there's memory and other cognitive difficulties. And if you actually went through formal testing, the memory testing and other cognitive tests might be abnormal. But there's no dementia, meaning the impairment isn't bad enough to get in the way of daily functioning. And then as the disease gets worse and more brain tissue gets hurt, that's when we get to the stage of dementia, where the memory and other cognitive difficulties are bad enough to impact daily life. Here's another way of looking at it. You start over here at the very earliest stages of the disease where the person is cognitively normal, and we refer to this as preclinical Alzheimer's disease. And then the individual goes through this kind of fuzzy time period where there seems to be some difficulties. There's some complaints from the individual, perhaps from people around them, and the testing might come back as being abnormal, but the person doesn't have difficulties in daily life, and we refer to that as MCI, or mild cognitive impairment, due to Alzheimer's disease. And then it gets worse and worse, and more brain tissue gets destroyed, and the difficulties in daily living and independence come up, and that's when we refer to it as dementia due to Alzheimer's disease. I'm going to run through some risk factors for Alzheimer's disease. Many of you already have attended webinars on these issues already, and I'm just going to go through some of them very, very quickly, because I want to get to the risk factor that today's webinar is all about, and that's traumatic brain injury. But the first one is age. Age is the greatest risk factor. Even though Alzheimer's disease is not part of normal aging, age is the greatest risk factor because, you know, we weren't meant to live past the age of around 40, and now we're living till decades and decades later, and we're seeing all kinds of diseases and conditions of aging that we would never have seen before. Cancer, heart disease, arthritis, glaucoma, you name it. And Alzheimer's disease and other neurodegenerative diseases are diseases of aging. Doesn't mean it's normal aging, but we can see them as people get older. And then I'm not going to go through much detail of these, but these are known or presumed risk factors for Alzheimer's disease: having a family history of dementia, having specific genetics. A very rare familial genetically caused Alzheimer's disease is just less than 1% of all cases of Alzheimer's. African Americans and Hispanics seem to be perhaps more at risk for developing the dementia from Alzheimer's disease. Women, females, have a greater risk for the dementia from Alzheimer's. People with lower education seem to be at greater risk through what we refer to as cognitive reserve, meaning people who have higher years of education or greater life exposure to things have a reserve against the underlying brain disease. And then vascular risk factors like having diabetes, high blood pressure, etc. But the one we're talking about right now is traumatic brain injury. So the question is traumatic brain injury, having a brain injury earlier in life, is it indeed a risk factor for Alzheimer's disease? And as you can see, there's way too many questions to answer this. The short way of answering to this question, does TBI lead to Alzheimer's dementia, is, well, not exactly. The longer answer is going to require us to first learn something about traumatic brain injuries. So let's talk about it. Traumatic brain injury is a pretty big thing. There's more than 10 million individuals worldwide who are affected each year by traumatic brain injury. And it's probably even greater because the majority of TBIs are mild in severity and people don't report them or they may not be recognized. Traumatic brain injury in our country, in the United States, is a major cause of death and disability. TBIs contribute to around 30% of all injury-related deaths. And every single day, there are at least 150 or so people in the US who die from injuries that include traumatic brain injury. And those who survive a TBI can face effects that can last a few days or all the rest of their lives. When it comes to the elderly, traumatic brain injuries are indeed extremely common and often caused by falls. As this diagram shows, around 40% of all traumatic brain injuries are due to falls. We classify traumatic brain injury by severity level. And so a severe traumatic brain injury is when the person has a loss of consciousness. They're out for more than a day. One might consider that coma for more than a day. And then there's a period of confusion and memory impairment for at least 7 days. And then the injury must easily be seen by a routine neuroimaging scan like a CAT scan or MRI. And by definition, there's usually symptoms that last for a long period of time and often do not fully go away. Then there's a moderate traumatic brain injury where the loss of consciousness, and I apologize for the typo, the loss of consciousness is somewhere between 30 minutes to 24 hours, but less than a day. And the confusion and memory impairment, though, can last from a day to 7 days. And again, you can see the injury on a routine picture of the brain, like a CAT scan or MRI. And the symptoms usually go away, but oftentimes they do not. And then comes the much more common type of traumatic brain injury, referred to as mild traumatic brain injury, or MTBI, which is actually the same thing as concussion. And so a concussion or an MTBI does not necessarily involve a loss of consciousness. And by definition, it can't have a loss of consciousness for greater than 30 minutes. And in fact, a small percentage of all concussions have any loss of consciousness at all. In other words, just because you don't black out doesn't mean you didn't have a concussion. Concussions or MTBIs cannot easily be seen on any routine CAT scan or MRI. And the injury in concussion takes place at the cellular and molecular level, caused by the stretching and shearing of the axons, those connections between all the brain cells. And it is not a bruise to the brain. A concussion if kind of an easier definition, is when the head or the body gets hit and the brain moves quickly, resulting in immediate changes to the brain cells. A very simplistic way to think of it is there's good stuff inside the brain cells that leave and bad stuff around the brain cells that go in. And all at the same time that the cells increase their needs for energy, but actually get less blood flowing to them right after the concussion. And at this time, when the cells are going through this kind of crisis, there are changes to the person's functioning, resulting in the symptoms and signs of concussion. And what do those symptoms include? Well, there's physical problems like you see there. There can be problems with thinking and memory, just feeling in a fog. There's problems with sleep, either too much or too little. And then changes in mood, becoming emotional, sad, even feeling hopeless and suicidal at times. But these symptoms only last for a few hours to a few days. And most people recover from a concussion between 1 and 3 weeks. Almost all people recover no later than 3 weeks. And some people, though, go on to have what's called post-concussion syndrome, when those symptoms do last more than a few weeks. But by definition, a concussion is temporary. It's a transient injury. So the question then is, does a single concussion increase one's risk for later life Alzheimer's disease or dementia? The answer is no, and we're going to go over this in greater detail. So going back to that other major issue is, does a traumatic brain injury serve as a risk factor for Alzheimer's disease, dementia? Well, the reason for the confusion is that earlier research suggested that having a moderate to severe TBI earlier in life did increase risk for later life Alzheimer's disease, dementia. But the findings were really equivocal. Some studies supported it, some studies said no. And what we find is that there were some problems with the earlier research, with very few studies, including post-mortem neuropathological examination of the brain. And so that underlying cause of the dementia was not certain, because really the only way to diagnose these neurodegenerative diseases very accurately is by looking at the brain tissue after someone dies. Most of those early studies only found the increased risk in men, but not in women. And none of the studies in the past ever asked about the individual's experience with having a prior traumatic brain injury, or perhaps exposure to other types of head impacts, like those from contact sports, such as football, boxing. And most studies examine relatively small numbers of subjects, which is always potentially going to be a problem when it comes to understanding and interpreting the results of any research. More recent studies, though, have included a larger scale type of investigation with many more subjects, including post-mortem examinations of the brain. And these studies now indicate that having a single moderate to severe traumatic brain injury can increase risk for other neurodegenerative diseases, such as Parkinson's disease or Lewy body disease, but not Alzheimer's disease. A recent study from our group here at Boston University showed that having a history of traumatic brain injury with loss of consciousness does not accelerate cognitive decline. And so it may be possible that some individuals who may already be in the early stages of Alzheimer's disease, they may not have the dementia yet, they may begin to show some symptoms or have some acceleration of the symptoms following a traumatic brain injury for a couple perhaps surprising reasons. One is that the injury itself may decrease the threshold or the reserve for the presentation of the symptoms, meaning the brain was already starting to be hurt by the underlying Alzheimer's disease, and then having this new injury just kind of said to the brain, okay, you just don't have enough oomph there to keep it going, and it decreased the threshold, and the disease started to show its symptoms more. Or perhaps, oftentimes we see that an individual, after having a traumatic brain injury, has greater surveillance by family members or healthcare providers. In other words, they're in the hospital, they're in rehabilitation, or family members come and visit them after the injury and they say, hey, you know what, mom or dad or my friend, they're not doing as well as I thought they were. Well, it could just be because you're now paying attention, whereas prior to the injury, people weren't. It's also possible that some individuals who have had a traumatic brain injury have a previous history of repetitive head impacts, like I was mentioning before, perhaps due to contact sports. And then instead of Alzheimer's disease, they may be at increased risk for another neurodegenerative disease. So stay tuned. That's what the rest of this talk will be about. I don't think you have any volume here hearing those big hits. These are the hits that indeed would be considered those hits that are in football that are trying to be diminished, but they're still just part of the game, these gigantic hits that do lead to the symptoms of concussions. And here's a surprise, probably. I'm actually not very concerned about concussions when it comes to later life neurodegenerative disease. This is going to hopefully explain that a little bit. If we think about that proverbial iceberg, the tip, the very, very tip of the iceberg involves moderate to severe traumatic brain injuries, the ones I described earlier. And underneath that, the one that really is just scratching the surface are those symptomatic mild traumatic brain injuries, or the concussions, the one that everyone's paying attention to these days. But underneath the surface, the bulk of that iceberg may include what we refer to as subconcussive trauma. And all that together we refer to as repetitive head impacts. And with the subconcussive hits, I just want you to think about those linemen in football. They're lined up like that in every play of every game of every practice. They hit their heads against their opponents. And some of these guys are 300 pounds or more, and they go head to head, but maybe they don't feel the pain because of those big helmets, but their brains sure do get moving around inside their skulls, surrounded by spinal fluid. And what that subconcussive trauma means is that there is an impact to the brain with adequate force to have an effect on neuronal functioning, but with no immediate symptoms of concussion. And some sports and some positions within those sports are indeed very prone. So like those pro football linemen, they may have 1,000 to 1,500 hits each season at around 20 to 30 G in force, which is actually a fairly hefty amount of force. And how do we know about these things? Well, some researchers now for over 10 years or so have been studying the types of hits that football players and other athletes get by putting accelerometer gizmos inside helmets. And these accelerometers measure the types of force that the hits bring to the helmet. So here's one study back in 2011 of high school football players. So all the high school football players on a team had these accelerometers inside their helmets, and they then counted the number of hits above 15 G of force over one season of play. And on average, these high schoolers had over 650 hits to the head, with one player having over 2,200 of these hits. Studies with college players, those numbers are indeed even higher. And there's been growing evidence with new research paper after new research paper coming out, suggesting that even after just one season, this repetitive subconcussive trauma can lead to cognitive, physiological, and even structural changes to the brain itself. A very to me, scary study came out just a few months ago from colleagues over at Wake Forest University, where they studied kids, youth, ages 8 to 12, playing tackle football. And the players who experienced more cumulative head impact exposure, meaning the more hits over a season, had greater changes in the brain's white matter after just that season, and no one with concussions was studied. And they did this by doing a special kind of MRI scan on all the kids before the season and after the season. And the kids who had the greatest number of hits had the greatest changes to their brain. Pretty interesting findings. And just imagine those little kids being the ones who had the changes to their brain structure. And so for me, the big question now is, do concussions and this more common subconcussive trauma lead to actual neurodegeneration, the destruction of brain tissue, and perhaps dementia? So if you think of these guys, this is an interesting sport. The goal of boxing is to induce a traumatic brain injury. And we've actually known about the long-term consequences of these repetitive head impacts in boxing for a long time. Back in 1928, there was a landmark paper published in the Journal of the American Medical Association called Punch Drunk. And in it, Dr. Martland described the long-term consequences of getting their heads hit in boxers, using such wonderful medical scientific terms as slug nutty and goofy to describe the person's behaviors. But he went on to say that later on in life, many of these former boxers required, quote, institutionalization in an asylum because of their dementia. And then the term dementia pugilistica, the dementia of boxers, was first used in 1937. And then this term that we've been talking about, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, has actually been used since the 1940s and 1950s. But it didn't start to really gain any public attention until people started knowing that American tackle football players might get this same disease. And the first American football player who passed away after a very tragic end of life was Mike Webster, and his brain was then examined by Dr. Bennett Omalu. And he found the same changes that used to be seen in boxers, but in this case, it was a tackle football player who had indeed chronic traumatic encephalopathy. And that began a huge amount of media attention to CTE because our beloved football players started to be seen to have this disease. So what is it? Well, CTE is the same as dementia pugilistica, the same thing that we used to see in boxers, still do. CTE is a neurodegenerative disease that is similar to Alzheimer's disease, but it is a unique disease. It's associated with having a history of repetitive head impacts, including concussions and subconcussive trauma. And this repetitive trauma appears to start a cascade of events in the brain that eventually leads to the progressive destruction of brain tissue. There's a lot we don't know. And there's been so much talk about CTE this and CTE that people think we know a lot, but there's a lot of things we really don't know. But there are some things I'm pretty confident about, such as CTE is not just prolonged post-concussion syndrome. It's not like someone just had a really big hit and they never got better. It's not the cumulative effects of a concussion or concussions. It's not like you have one concussion, you have some symptoms, then you have another, and you have more symptoms, and then there's more brain damage associated with it, and it gets worse each time you have a concussion. That's not it. In fact, it's not a brain injury or traumatic brain injury per se. It's a neurodegenerative disease. And this disease appears to begin earlier in life, but the symptoms often begin years or decades after the brain trauma ends. and then the symptoms continue to worsen. And in fact, now through the years, we've seen numerous cases of neuropathologically confirmed CTE without any history of symptomatic concussions, but in people with extensive exposure to these subconcussive hits. And like Alzheimer's disease and other similar neurodegenerative diseases, even right now in 2017, CTE can currently only be diagnosed through a postmortem examination of the brain. My colleague here, Dr. Ann McKee at BU, has examined more brains with CTE than any other neuropathologist anywhere. And our center with the BU VA Concussion Legacy Foundation Brain Bank is the largest brain bank of its type in the world, with over 300 brains examined so far of people who have a history of repetitive hits to the head. So what is CTE? Don't be scared off by this this picture. I'll try to explain it, but it's characterized, CTE is characterized by an abundance of something you've already heard about today, that abnormal form of tau protein, the p-tau protein. And here's a picture of it. And there's two key features that make the diagnosis of CTE unique from any other. The first is this accumulation of the tau protein. All the brown stuff is the tau protein, with these things being the neurofibrillary tangles around a small blood vessel. This little white bit is a small blood vessel inside the brain. And so the tau starts to accumulate around those small blood vessels, but only in very specific areas earlier in the course of the disease. Here you see a larger image of the brain tissue without being under a microscope. And what you see is this accumulation of all this brown stained tau protein at the depths of what's called the cortical sulcus, right here, one of the valleys of the brain's cortex. And so right in here at the depths of that cortex inside the brain is where the tau protein starts to accumulate. And so again, if that tau sounds familiar, it's the same type of abnormal tau, these neurofibrillary tangles that were found in Alzheimer's disease. But there's something interesting here. The amyloid plaques of Alzheimer's are not part of the CTE diagnosis. Remember this progression of the tau protein in Alzheimer's disease? Well, I'm going to show you a comparison to what happens in CTE. Early on, the tau protein starts in the depths of those sulci, those valleys of the cortex here in the frontal lobes. And then it progresses more around that area, and then perhaps in deeper areas of the brain, and then it expands, and the medial temporal lobe here, these structures here that you do see in Alzheimer's also then start to get involved, and eventually the whole brain can be devastated by it. But as you can see, it's a different pattern and a different progression between Alzheimer's and CTE. So when this is all happening, what are the symptoms of this disease? I think people are familiar with the symptoms of Alzheimer's. Well, the symptoms of CTE can be somewhat different. There are changes in mood, such as sadness and depression. Often there's apathy or the lack of caring about things. Often there's anxiety and agitation, and frequently someone can have rage. And there's also changes in behavior. Having a short fuse is one of the most common changes in behavior. Problems with impulse control, and oftentimes there can be aggressive behavior. And then there's changes in cognitive functioning, including poor memory, the same types of memory problems that you might see in Alzheimer's disease, as well as problems with what we refer to as executive functioning, such as having poor judgment and decision-making, impaired organizational and planning skills, and difficulty with multitasking. And eventually, as more brain tissue gets destroyed, these changes in cognitive functioning will lead to dementia. Remember what dementia means. It doesn't mean that they get Alzheimer's disease. It means that they're having problems with memory, and other cognitive difficulties that get in the way of daily functioning. What I want to do is shift gears and show you some real life examples of this very tragic disease. This was the first brain donation to our center of a former National Football League player. This was that of John Grimsley. And I'm showing you these pictures because the family members of anyone who we ever show pictures of or tell their stories have allowed us to do so. They wanted the stories to be made public so people could learn. John Grimsley sadly died at age 45. He was a wonderful linebacker, played for the Houston Oilers for much of his career. He was in Pro Bowl in 1988. And what's important to understand is he was a hunting and fishing guide when he retired from the NFL. I tell you that because you need to know he knew his way around his firearms. But for the 5 years prior to his death, and again, he died tragically at age 45, but starting around age 40, he started experiencing worsening memory problems, worsening cognitive functioning, as well as a short fuse. He used to be calm and never blow up at anything, and he just started blowing up all the time at stuff and couldn't remember things that were told him just a day before. And then sadly, he died of an accidental gunshot to the chest while he was cleaning his gun one night. It was deemed not to be suicide, and what they thought was that he probably either got the order of things messed up and he started to work on the gun before removing the ammunition. Well, his brain was donated to our center by his wife, Virginia, and up above you see Dr. McGee's work, where you see a part of the brain just under a scanner with the tissue stained for that abnormal tau protein. And you can see at age 45 how much buildup of it right here in the depths of the sulcus, that little valley of the cortex. And under a microscope, you see these neurofibrillary tangles, as well as a lot of other abnormal tau. But let's put it in perspective. What does this compare to? Let's look at the brain of a healthy 65-year-old. This is what a healthy brain should look like without any cognitive difficulties, without these diseases. There's none of that abnormal tau protein. Another perspective is to look at the brain of a 73-year-old world-class boxer who died after several years in a nursing facility where he was clinically diagnosed with dementia pugilistica. And lo and behold, yes, that's what he had. He had CTE. But compare the 45-year-old boxer, a 45-year-old football player, to the 73-year-old boxer. Another case, just to put it in perspective, is that of Dave Duerson, who played for the Chicago Bears, actually the last time they played in the Super Bowl. He was an incredibly successful football player who went on to be an incredibly successful business person after his NFL career. He had a tremendously successful business, made lots and lots of money. He also had a wonderful family, wonderful wife and kids. Unfortunately, he started having complaints of headaches since the time he was playing, and they got worse. But for those 5 years prior to his death at age 50, he had this spiraling down functioning where he had progressive short-term memory problems, couldn't remember things from day to day, as well as problems with language. And then he started acting increasingly out of control. He had a short fuse, was hot-tempered, and sadly, he became physically abusive and verbally abusive to the point where his wife had to leave him. He also lost his business due to bad business decisions and acting impulsively and not having just good overall judgment. He lost everything. And sadly, he took his own life, shooting himself in the chest in order to save his brain and ask that his brain be donated for examination. And yes, indeed, he did have CTE. At 50 years old, it was pretty significant. So there's been a lot of media hype about lots and lots of former professional football players who've died and whose brains have had CTE. But it's not just football where CTE has been found. It's been seen right now in over 250 individuals, including those pro football players, but also, as you'd expect, in boxers. It's also been seen in pro wrestlers and pro hockey players. So far, only in the enforcers, the boxers on ice. Here's something that's a little bit concerning. It's been seen in professional soccer players who've died after years of dementia as well, and it seemed to be associated with heading and not a history of concussion. And it's also been seen in professional rugby players. As an example, here's a case of Tizza Taylor, who died at age 77. He was a very well-known Australian rugby player who's a hardcore player, played for many, many years. Sadly, he had cognitive difficulties beginning in his 50s and very severe dementia in his 60s, and finally he passed away at age 77. And here's slices of his brain that you may or may not understand what you're seeing, but the brain should not look like that at all. It's lost just a tremendous amount of its brain tissue, of all of its tissue just atrophied away. And all the brown you see is that abnormal tau protein. And there wasn't any of the amyloid protein suggesting Alzheimer's disease. This is all chronic traumatic encephalopathy due to those years of hitting his head playing rugby. It's also not just professional athletes. And this is where it starts to be perhaps a public health issue. We've seen CTE in people who've only played up through college football. We've actually seen it in people who just played up through high school football. It's been seen in our military service members as well, who've been exposed to traumatic brain injuries, to blast injury, to repetitive hits. It's also been seen in people as young as age 17 and all the way up through the 90s. What's interesting, though, is I think that indeed Dr. McKee's and others' groundbreaking work on the neuropathology of CTE has had a great impact on public policy and on awareness. People talk about it all the time. I think those pictures of the neuropathology paint 1,000 words. But I think the public actually has a sense that we know more about CTE than we really do. And what's gone on is that the media attention and the culture changes due to these cases of CTE, making people pay more attention to concussions. It's led to all this attention in magazines and movies and TV. I got to be on 60 Minutes. That was exciting. The problem is that the reality is that the science moves slowly. By definition, science moves at that much slower pace. And therefore, we couldn't possibly come up with all the answers so quickly when we've only been looking at this disease in any kind of attention for the last just handful of years. And so I used to say that we're in the infancy of our knowledge of CTE, but I think we're learning more. We're in the toddlerhood now of our understanding of CTE. What we know or what we don't know. That's the big question. We don't know a lot. Like, is it common? We don't know how common it is because we need to do longitudinal studies, and that requires the ability to diagnose CTE during life. Another question that needs to be answered is, why do some people get CTE and others do not? Well, one thing I am pretty confident about is that all post-mortem neuropathologically confirmed cases of CTE have had one thing in common. And that one thing is a history of repetitive hits to the head. What that translates into is that repetitive head impact exposure is a necessary variable to get CTE, but it's obviously not a sufficient cause of CTE. In other words, not everyone who hits their head a lot is going to get it. They're not going to get this neurodegenerative disease. And so we have to figure out what the risk factors for CTE are. Perhaps some people are more prone to it because of genetics. Are there susceptibility genes? Well, we've done some initial work on the ApoE gene that also seems to increase the susceptibility for Alzheimer's disease and other diseases of aging. And yeah, it seems to increase the risk, but it doesn't cause it. So we need to be able to diagnose CT during life in order to be able to do large-scale studies of the genetic risk. And then what are the exposure variables? And exposure, I mean the getting your head hit. What is it about getting your head hit that might lead to this brain disease? Does it have to do with the severity of the hits or the types of the trauma? Does it have to do with the amount of time between each hit? Because the brain might be able to clear any bad stuff or to recover if enough time is left between the hits. But if you get hit over and over and over again, perhaps that's what might lead to the beginnings of this disease. But we don't know for sure. Is it the overall duration? The number of years, number of seasons people play a sport that leads to getting this disease, or perhaps these last two things that we've been focusing on a lot, the total amount of hits over life, and one very important thing, the age of first exposure to getting your head hit. So one question our team looked at was what, if any, are the long-term consequences of getting these repetitive head impacts during what might be critical periods of the brain's development. In other words, it's possible that there are windows of neurodevelopmental vulnerability during which getting your head hit may result in negative short-term and long-term outcomes. So one such period of this vulnerable brain development may be the years between ages 9 and 12, when we know that there's tremendous maturation of the brain. All kinds of things are maturing and growing and developing just in that time period before adolescence. And so at the time, a doctoral student of mine, Julie Stam, had the idea to look at this, and we went into the data of a study of ours of former NFL players. And what she did was she looked at the question of, does starting to play before age 12 lead to greater problems later on? And indeed, the former NFL players in this study who started playing tackle football before age 12 had greater current problems with mental flexibility, planning, organization, and memory. They had significantly more memory impairment than the ones who started playing tackle football at age 12 or older. And then in another study of a similar group, she found that former players who started playing football before age 12 had changes to the brain, to the structures of the brain, the integrity of what's called the corpus callosum, the largest connections between the two hemispheres of the brain.
Still stopping.
And so the question is,
my gosh,
do these 6-year-olds, 7-year-olds getting hit like that on a regular basis have any increased risk for later life changes such as CTE or other problems? Well, another step in examining this exposure would be to not just look at pro football players, but to look at people who only played up through high school or to college. And so our group, under another student of mine, an MD PhD student of mine, Philip Montenegro, looked at the cumulative number of hits. And I won't go into all the detail, but just to let you know that when we looked at the total number of hits that were estimated that individuals had in their life, there was this dose-response relationship between the number of head impacts and later life changes in clinically meaningful cognitive problems, mood disturbance, and behavioral impairment. And with each additional 1,000 hits that someone had through their life, the risk of later life impairments increased significantly. Now, you have to know this wasn't a study of chronic traumatic encephalopathy. In order to understand the actual risk for this disease, we'd need to be able to diagnose it during life. But as an example from that study, you can see that the more hits that people got, this is each additional 1,000 hits over one's life, the greater the risk here for clinically significant cognitive impairment. And so what you might have guessed is that in order to answer these questions, we need to be able to diagnose CT during life. By doing so, we'd be able to understand how common it is. Is it indeed a public health issue? We'd be able to figure out the risk factors. Most importantly, we'd be able to start clinical trials of medications to treat and hopefully prevent CTE. And to do so, the important step would be to develop objective biological tests, or another word for that is biomarkers. Tests that will say, yeah, it looks like this person has this specific disease. And similar to what's been going on in Alzheimer's disease, these biomarkers, in addition to a good clinical evaluation, will lead to a much greater accuracy in our ability to diagnose CTE during life, and perhaps even before there are symptoms. And so just like that preclinical Alzheimer's disease, well, if we could have appropriate biomarkers to detect those abnormal changes in the tau protein before there's any symptoms, we'll be able to detect preclinical CTE as well. And so just with Alzheimer's disease, early detection of CTE could hopefully lead to early disease modification. And by doing that, the earlier we start, we might actually have prevention. And so what you see here is the normal course of chronic traumatic encephalopathy, starting here at the preclinical time, perhaps soon after getting the exposure to all those hits, and then going through the period of having some mild symptoms, perhaps the mood and behavior difficulties, and then the cognitive impairment starts and the dementia from it gets worse and worse, and eventually the person may die. But instead of starting new treatments here after someone has dementia, what if we could start it while they're in the early stages and bring it up to that preclinical time? Well, maybe we'd actually be able to prevent the disease. So one of the major areas of focus for me, for my research over the last several years, has been just that, to be able to try to detect the disease through objective biomarkers and to be able to describe what the clinical presentation of CT really looks like during life. So I was fortunate to get a grant from the National Institutes of Health several years ago for a study that we referred to as the DETECT study, or diagnosing and evaluating traumatic encephalopathy using clinical tests. Now, you got to admit, that's one of the best acronyms you've ever heard. Well, through that study, we brought in around 100 former NFL players between the ages of 40 and 69 years old. They were all symptomatic. Before they came in, they had to acknowledge over a phone interview some types of symptoms of mood and behavior and thinking. And then we also had 30 control subjects, the same age, 40 to 69, but no contact sport history, no traumatic brain injury history, etc. And they all went through 2 to 3 days of extensive study, where they had neuroimaging of special types of MRI scans and things called magnetic resonance spectroscopy. These were all done by my colleagues, Dr. Shenton and Kurta and Lynn over at the Brigham and Women's Hospital in Harvard. They had lumbar punctures or spinal taps, where we looked at the spinal fluid for the various proteins. They had EEGs conducted. They had blood drawn so we could look at genetics and also potential new biomarkers through blood. And they had extensive clinical examinations, neurological examinations, neuropsychological, psychiatric interviews, motor assessment, you name it. And from that study that ended almost a year and a half ago, we've had several important findings that advanced MRI techniques might give us some knowledge about how to diagnose this disease. We've had experimental blood tests that seem to have some preliminary hope for being able to diagnose it. And we've been using new types of PET scans that are looking pretty good to be able to move forward to get to the point where we can diagnose this disease. But the next important step, obviously, is to have another good acronym. And so we came up with Diagnose CTE Research Project, which probably isn't as good an acronym as the other one, but this is what it stands for. And more importantly, It's not just obviously the acronym, I'm joking, it's the ability to obtain funding from the National Institutes of Health to do a very important study. And I'm very fortunate indeed to have three amazing co-principal investigators, Dr. Jeffrey Cummings, Dr. Eric Ryman from the Banner Alzheimer's Institute, and Dr. Martha Shenton from the Brigham and Women's Hospital in Harvard. So together we're leading this 7-year multi-center study with additional 50 collaborators from 10 research institutions around the country. The idea is to break down research silos and to try to collaborate in all ways to be able to come up with the right answers as quickly as we can. So these are the various institutions that we're working with. And what we're needing right now, because we've started this big project, is we need you. We need research participants. We need men age 45 to 74, and we don't need just football players. We need people who never played contact sports or who had any history of brain injury and who are feeling good now. They have no cognitive difficulties. So we need as many healthy controls as we can get, age 45 to 74, to help us understand this disease and come up with the right way of diagnosing it. For the study, we're also examining former college football players. So if anyone out there listening, or if you know anyone who played college ball and who has symptoms now or who doesn't have symptoms, who may have some mild dementia or nothing at all or everything in between, again, the same age between age 45 and 74. And then if you happen to know any former NFL players, yes, we're studying them as well, with or without symptoms, in the same age. And when people do participate, what's involved, I won't go into all the different types of studies, but it's a 3-day evaluation, similar to what I described before for the DETECT study, where there's 2 PET scans and extensive MRI scans and a spinal tap and completion of questionnaires and standardized tests. And people receive travel to one of our sites to have all these tests done at no cost to them. We pay for the travel, and in addition, participants can receive up to $500 compensation. And people can go to any one of these 4 sites, either Arizona, New York, Boston, or Las Vegas. So if you're interested in this, please contact us. Taylor Platt is my recruitment coordinator for this study at our central coordinating study center here at Boston University. If you don't take this information down now, you can just Google diagnose CTE or just type in diagnosect.com and you'll find out everything you need to know about the study. And you know, if that doesn't work, there's one good way for us to move forward. We could learn from our animals, animal friends. On the bottom, it says, I read that story about dementia and former NFL players. Maybe we should reconsider this. So everyone, in summary, what I hope you've understood through this long webinar is that moderate to severe traumatic brain injury may lead to increased risk for some neurodegenerative diseases, but not necessarily Alzheimer's disease. And a single traumatic brain injury with a loss of consciousness does not accelerate the cognitive decline or lead to dementia. And a single concussion, the mild TBI, or even a bunch of concussions, does not necessarily lead to dementia later in life. But exposure to a lot of these repetitive head impacts from contact sports or other activities, and I'm referring to the symptomatic concussions, but also the much more common subconcussive hits. This type of exposure can lead to another and unique neurodegenerative disease, CTE. And like Alzheimer's disease, CTE begins years or decades before the very first symptoms. And then, as it gets worse, in many cases, it eventually leads to dementia. I'll just end acknowledging just is a handful of all the wonderful people I get to work with at Boston University and across many other organizations and around the world. These are the people who do all the incredible work and are just brilliant researchers and collaborators. And with that, will lead to some questions. So thank you very much for giving me this opportunity.
Great, thank you, Dr. Stern. We're now going to begin answering questions submitted during today's presentation. We do have several. So our first question is, do all contact sports increase the likelihood of dementia later in life?
Yeah, that's a good question. No, it's not all contact sports, and we don't know enough about it yet, but it seems to be the ones that have the greatest repetitive hits, such as tackle football or perhaps boxing, where the hits go on and on and on. But things like hockey, we're not that sure of. Things like soccer, we're not really sure of yet, but it seems that in soccer, it's going to be the heading, not the big hits to the ground or head-to-head hits, but maybe the repetitive heading of the ball that might lead to CTE. But what we think is that it's not just the sports that have the big concussions, it's the sports that have the most cumulative amount of repetitive hits.
Thank you. The next question is, I've been told that I am not eligible for Alzheimer's prevention studies due to previous traumatic brain injury. Why is that?
Yeah, that's an important issue. Whenever we do prevention studies for Alzheimer's disease, we need to make sure that what we're studying is Alzheimer's disease. And if someone has a history of a traumatic brain injury, just like if they have a history of another brain disorder like Parkinson's disease, or if they've had a big stroke in the past, we wouldn't be sure that what we're trying to prevent is indeed Alzheimer's disease. And so in any kind of research study, we have to make sure that the group of people who are being examined are relatively clean. In other words, they don't have other types of conditions that have hurt their brain in some way that might lead to something else other than the disease that we're focusing on, such as Alzheimer's.
Great, thank you. Here's a question from a concerned grandparent. My 15-year-old grandson had a concussion playing hockey. Should he stop playing in order to lower his chances of developing CTE or dementia?
Oh, I'm so glad this question was asked. I hear this so often. You know, there's been this increased hype about CTE and that if you have one concussion, you're going to get dementia later on, or even such awful, scary things like, oh, you're going to get severely depressed and take your life. Well, those things aren't necessarily real. Having one concussion in a sport does not mean that you have this increased risk for later life disease or even significant problems in the short term. As long as that concussion is appropriately rested, treated, and there's an appropriate return to play, then there shouldn't be any issue at all. It's really important for everyone to understand, especially when you're thinking about your grandchildren, that being involved in athletics is so important. Being involved in all kinds of activities and sports provides such necessary exercise and team building and all the great things that are required for a healthy individual. The big question, though, is what do we do about our children, our grandchildren, who want to play sports such as contact football or tackle football early in life, when we're not really sure what the later life problems might be? And I don't have a good answer to that. But just having a single concussion from another sport, don't be afraid.
Thank you. The next question is, how are CTE and traumatic brain injury different?
Yeah, so that's one of the things I was trying to really clarify during the talk, but it's always something that seems to be confusing to people. Traumatic brain injury is an acute injury to the person's brain from getting your head hit or your body hit, where the brain itself is injured one unique time. And that injury, depending on the severity level, may get better. And in some cases, if it's a real severe injury, it actually might lead to significant problems for the rest of life and perhaps even death at the time. CTE, though, is a brain disease that starts early in life, we think due to a whole lot of small repetitive hits, and then eventually gets worse and worse and leads to the destruction of brain tissue and those symptoms that I described earlier. So traumatic brain injury is a single brain injury, whereas CTE is a progressive disease that's similar to Alzheimer's.
Great, thank you for that clarification. The next question is CTE getting more common? If so, why?
Well, this is a good analogy. We just purchased a new car, and every time I'm driving around now, I see the same car that I never thought was a common car. Probably many people out there had that same experience, that once you start looking for something, you start seeing it more. And that may be one of the things we're seeing now with CT, is that the more people look, the more they find. And people weren't looking for it until very recently. But I think one of the other issues is that, in fact, we may indeed have a growing problem on our hands. I don't know this for sure, but I think it's important to understand that in the history of humankind, in the 200,000 years that humans have walked the earth, people never were exposed to repetitive hits to the head. Sure, back in the caves, a rock might have fallen on the head, or someone might have gotten clubbed, or whatever it might be, a single big injury, the traumatic brain injury. But when we think of human beings repeatedly hitting their heads over and over and over again, it actually wasn't until around the 1950s. And let me explain that. When it comes to repeated hits, in American football, that's been around since the 1800s, tackle football, it wasn't until the mid to late 50s that those big plastic helmets started to be used and the face masks started to be required. And when those big helmets and face masks started to be used, the game changed, where people could hit against another player over and over again, whether it was the big hits or just like I described earlier at the line of scrimmage, these little hits over and over and over again. Well, that didn't happen until the 1950s. And there's really no other activity that includes that type of repetitive hit. And so those people who started to play tackle football in the 1950s, let's say in high school, are only in their 60s or 70s now. And CTE is, like Alzheimer's, a disease of aging, and as people get older, the more we might see. But more concerning is that it wasn't until the late 60s and early 70s that tackle football started to be played in childhood through Pop Warner. And that's when kids around the country started putting those helmets on with those face masks and started to hit their heads over and over again, hundreds, thousands of times throughout childhood. And those people are only in their 50s and early 60s at this point. So I'm not sure, but I think there may be something somewhat concerning as a public health issue in the next years and decades to come.
Great, thank you. The next question is, does CTE cause suicide?
Yeah, suicide is one of the most complex behaviors that human beings have. It's so multifaceted and sadly all too common, and all too common amongst very important age groups like adolescents and young adults, and now amongst the elderly. And so suicide, because it is so multifaceted with so many different causes, there's no way we can say that CTE causes suicide. what people might be thinking of when they hear about this is because there's been some high-profile deaths of former athletes who died of suicide, and their brains were examined, and yes, indeed, they were found to have CTE. But the question was, whether CTE actually resulted in the suicide. I'm not sure. I can tell you this, that some of the symptoms that are due to the changes in the brain from CTE, such as having impulse control problems, such as having hyper emotional reactions, that sadness and responding emotionally and not being able to put a lid on things, well, those things may come together and lead tragically to suicide. But that doesn't mean that everyone with this disease results in suicidal behavior or tragically suicide.
Thank you for that. Our final question is, are there treatments for CTE?
Well, right now, if we think of CTE as that accumulation of the abnormal tau protein, we view it as what's called a tauopathy, similar to Alzheimer's disease, which is another tauopathy. And fortunately, right now, there are many compounds that drug companies and scientists are developing that are aimed at either reducing the amount of the abnormal tau in the brain or hopefully bringing it out of the brain. But those are in the early stages of development to this point. And so there are no available treatments to actually alter the course of the disease at this point. I have a lot of hope that in the next 5 years or so there will be. But first we need to be able to diagnose this tau change in CTE during life, because then we could start to put people into these clinical trials and examine these new compounds. But in the meantime, it's really important for everyone to understand that just because we can't treat the underlying disease, there are still important treatments that can be taken to alter the symptoms. So if people have changes in mood and they have significant depression, there's still wonderful treatments, both medically and behaviorally and psychotherapy, to help with the depression and the hopelessness. If people have increased agitation or anxiety, there's appropriate treatments for that. If people do start having the beginnings of some memory difficulty, there are those treatments that can be used for Alzheimer's disease memory impairment that can give someone a little bit of a boost for a short period of time. So there are treatments available right away, and we don't need to wait until we have the approved treatments for the underlying disease.
That was our final question. I want to conclude by thanking Dr. Stern and thanking everyone for attending today's StudyTalks webinar, Head Injury and Alzheimer's Disease, and Does Playing Football Lead to Dementia? You will receive a follow-up email within 1 week with a link to view the recording of today's webinar. On behalf of Alzheimer's Prevention Registry, thank you for joining us and have a great rest of the day.